right, guys, thanks so much for coming tonight. Good turnout. Good to see that a lot of interest in our inaugural Econ and English event with Dr. Louis Johnston, the Joseph P. Ferry Professor here at St. Johnston. Speaking of Joseph Ferry, wow, that's honored to have him in the audience here on our left. And his memorial professorship is now being occupied by Louis, and he's still here. Memorial, yeah, honor. Yeah, you know what I meant. Anyways, so before we get started, I do want to just say that we will have pizza coming in the back there. It should be coming here any second, so feel free to get up and grab some of that when that comes in, and enjoy this. Yeah. Oh, and also, yeah, there's some cards back there that have a little cheat sheet with different terms that you might want to learn about, and be sure to grab some McCarthy Center swag in the back too. There's some pens that you should definitely use, and loose. It's good advertising for us. So. All of it.
Okay. Cool. Well, wow. I was just saying to Tyler, we've passed the first hurdle. There are people here. This is good. This is very good. Can you hear me back? I wasn't going to use a microphone or anything. Sure. I mean, it's so pretentious. Anyway, pretentious enough for me to dress this way. But, it's my uniform. Welcome. This is an experiment that you're going to join in tonight. What I want to try to do is present economic ideas in plain English. So I thought cleverly I'd call it Econ in English. Wow, that's really clever, right? I always joke to my econ students, economists never have cool names for anything. We always have really boring names, like the money supply is called M1. Wow, that's pretty cool. So we'll give this a whirl, but I want to encourage a dialogue and a conversation. I've got some slides, but they're more just as props. I'm going to use them more as props and things like that. What I want to do is answer questions that you've got. So we'll use that to get things going. And let's be on our way. So, what the heck is the Federal Reserve? Let me start out with something a little different first, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. Does anybody recognize who this is? My guess is you wouldn't, but some might. That's Milton Friedman, probably one of the most famous economists of the second half of the 20th century. He was a Nobel laureate in 1976. If you know that one, I'll be impressed. Okay, this is George Stigler. He was also a professor at the University of Chicago, along with Milton Friedman. And in fact, they were lifetime friends. Milton's on the left. So that's me, right? Over there. They met in graduate school back at Columbia University in the 1930s. Then they kind of were apart during World War II. And then they met again at the University of Minnesota in 1946, where they both taught for 1 year. And then they were apart for another couple of years, and then in 1950, George Stigler came to the University of Chicago. Milton Friedman had come 2 years before, and voila, they were faculty members at the University of Chicago into the early 1990s. They both won the Nobel Prize. They both were very active in both theoretical economics and in the stuff we're talking about today, in economic education, in trying to put things into English. And Friedman had 2 television programs that became very, I don't know if popular is the right word for economics, but well-known, shall we say. In the 70s and 80s, he wrote a column for Newsweek every other week for almost 25 years, which I can't believe someone could keep that up, but he did. He was everywhere. When Stigler won the Nobel Prize in 1982, the New York Times contacted him, and the reporter started asking him some questions, and he asked him a question that in retrospect I'm not sure I would ask. He said, well, it's wonderful that you won the Nobel Prize, Professor Stigler. Remember him? But they already gave it to Milton Friedman. And you guys are pretty much the same, aren't you? Why would they give it to you too? And instead of throwing the guy out of his office or getting really, really angry at him, he said this. And I've always found that to be words to live by as an economist. because you can try to save the world, but I think in order to do it, you have to understand it first. So let's have that be the motto for tonight's session, and if we're lucky, for the sessions to come. That we're out to understand the world, not to start with saving it. So let me give you a quick overview of what we're going to do. We'll start with what is the Fed. We'll look at some of its structure. We'll look at its history a little bit. Then we'll ask my favorite question, which is, who cares? I see a number of students who've had me in class who've heard this way too many times, but you know, if you can't answer the question, who cares, to something, I think you're in deep trouble. And the answer to who cares is in the form of a phrase that's come to be known as the dual mandate, and I'll explain what that is in a few minutes. And we need to look at that both in theory and in practice. And the way I'd like to organize things tonight is, we'll walk through this a little bit, and then I'll just try and stop talking for a few minutes and just answer questions. You know, what do you want to know about its history, its structure, that kind of stuff. And then if the discussion starts going in this direction, we'll move here. I'll add a little bit about some of the background about the dual mandate, about how things work in the world, in theory and in the world. And then again, we can just open things up to questions. And then, you know, if we have time, we can open up even broader. I'll take any question. I don't promise answers. I only promise to try. So here's one smart aleck answer to what is the Fed. Well, there it is. It's a building. It's right behind the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, in fact, if you're ever in Washington, D.C. In fact, if you start at Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial and then walk towards the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and keep going, it's just right there. It's a big building that looks a lot like something built in the 1930s because, in fact, it was. It's a New Deal structure. And it's the headquarters for what's called the Federal Reserve System. So here's another answer to the question, what the heck is the Fed? The Fed is the United States Central Bank. So that's, I think, the first term on your little card up there, or it's the second. No, the Federal Reserve System is the central bank. Yep. So of course that begs the question, what the heck is a central bank? Well, a central bank is an institution that governments set up to do two things. First of all, they set them up in order to help keep the financial system stable, to both monitor it, to see how well things are working, and in times of crises, to backstop it, to keep it from falling apart. The other thing that central banks have to do is monetary policy. So let me explain each of these in a little bit more detail. So by financial system stability and monitoring the financial system, there are basically two kinds of policies that the Fed has to do. First of all, they're involved in bank regulation. They literally are involved in regulating the places where you guys put your money in checking accounts and saving deposits and things like that, and regulate them. Now the Fed isn't the only organization that does that. There's a whole array of organizations at the state and local and federal level that do this. But the Fed is one of those institutions. So you can think of that as kind of a microeconomic, if you've heard that phrase, small scale job that the Fed does. I say micro because the other kind of financial system stability that the Fed has to monitor is something with the, again, very uncool name, mouthful, of macroprudential policy. Macroprudential policy is a fancy way of saying, keep an eye on the entire system and don't get bogged down in just looking at individual banks. Look at the whole thing, right? And in particular, there's a phrase that's come out of this that you might have heard. It's called too big to fail. It's the idea that you can't let certain banks get too big, or else if they fail, they'll pull the whole system down. Well, macroprudential policies is a fancy way of saying we have to watch out for that. We have to make sure that certain banks that are really, really big don't do stupid things and pull the whole system down. I like that better than macroprudential. I'm not at the Fed, so. Monetary policy is the other thing the Federal Reserve does. And by monetary policy, again, I mean two things. First of all, the Federal Reserve is in charge of controlling the nation's money supply. What's the money supply? Well, it's literally just the amount of cash and currency in circulation, plus the amount of bank deposits, plus a whole variety of things that the Federal Reserve keeps an eye on that look like bank deposits. Money market mutual funds, things like that. Why do we care about that? Well, we care about that because of short-term interest rates. It turns out by moving the money supply around, the Federal Reserve can either raise or lower short-term interest rates. Now, if we were having this talk back in 2008 or 2009, I would go to the next slide. I wouldn't say anything more, because that's what the Federal Reserve did in terms of monetary policy. Monitored short-term interest rates. The reason why it only monitored short-term interest rates is because the idea was pretty simple. If you change short-term interest rates, all the other interest rates would follow. So, for example, if you lowered the interest rate on 90-day loans, that would bring down the rate on 10-year loans, on 30-year loans, everything. They would all just kind of move together. Well, starting in 2008, the Federal Reserve put the short-term interest rate roughly at 0. I don't know if you know this, but you can't go below 0. Right? It's a pain, because you've always got these green pieces of paper in your wallet or somewhere, it's a $5 bill, that earns 0% interest. Right? I can always earn 0 on this thing. So it never makes sense to have a negative interest rate, or at least a negative nominal interest rate. So the Fed found itself in a position where it literally it couldn't push interest rates down anymore. So they came up with a new strategy to purchase long-term assets, to go out and buy long-term government bonds, and to buy what are called mortgage-backed securities, literally securities that are backed up by home mortgages. And that program came to be known as quantitative easing. But again, that's just a fancy name for doing monetary policy. But instead of doing it on the short end, we're doing it on the long end of interest rates. We're affecting them directly instead of hoping that they all go down when the short-term rate goes down. All right, well, how did we get to have this institution is a question that a lot of people ask me. So let me give you a short history of the Fed, really short, because we could go a long time on this. It starts with the Constitution. In the Constitution, it says that Congress alone shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Now, you can raise your hand. I saw a few people from my American Economic History class who have taken it with me. Yeah, we just did this the other day. This was a huge issue before the Constitution was passed. Every state, and previously every colony, had its own currency. And one of the things that they settled in the Constitution was, we're not going to do that. We're going to have one unit of currency for this entire country. And Congress has the power to regulate it, to control its supply, or as they put it, to regulate the value thereof. Well, Congress did this. Not very well. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, but overall they didn't do a very good job of regulating this directly. They tried to create a couple of institutions before the Civil War. Between the mid-1830s and 1863, they basically got out of the business altogether. The federal government had nothing to do with money. They had what was called free banking. During the Civil War, we started to have, I won't pull it out again, pieces of paper that are green on the back, like our currency today that the federal government started to issue. But finally, after a series of increasingly severe banking panics, where banks were literally collapsing, and I meant that, not first, literally, the buildings themselves were collapsing because of people coming in. Finally, in 1913, after appointing a Federal Monetary Commission, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act to actually create a central bank for the United States. And in 1914, it went to work. Well, it's not quite that simple. They didn't create a central bank. Take a look at this map. It's divided up into 12 regions. If you think about American history, especially during the 19th century, one of the things that keeps coming up over and over and over again is a concern about concentrated power. A concern that oh, we don't want those bankers on Wall Street to control everything, or we don't want the big bad government in Washington to control things, or in Minnesota, we don't want St. Paul to control. We always are worried about, concentrated power. Same thing happened when we created a central bank. People were very worried about this, so they said, all right, we'll create 12 of them. Think about that. Not one. We're going to create 12 central banks. One for each economic region of the country. So we'll have one here in New York. It'll do mostly foreign trade, but also take care of the Empire State's economic needs. We'll have one in Boston for the New England economy. We'll have one in Philadelphia for this big industrial heartland here in eastern Pennsylvania. We'll have one in Richmond for these coastal states, Atlanta here. By the way, a little historical footnote, Atlanta also was the central bank of Cuba until Fidel Castro took power. The Atlanta Fed basically acted as its central bank. Cleveland, Chicago. This one, Minneapolis, is very interesting to me, and don't let me get off on this tangent because you'll never get me back, but this is basically the route of the old Sioux Line Railroad and the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. That's why it has that shape. Here's a little historical fun fact. Notice Missouri has 2 Federal Reserve banks. Chair of the House Banking Committee in 1913 just happened to be from a district that's right around here. This one was supposed to go to Denver, and they were really mad when it didn't go to Denver. Dallas, and then of course up here, San Francisco has a Federal Reserve District. If you think about this and the scale of Hawaii and Alaska, it's just humongous. In a sense, this is a map of what the U.S. economy looked like in 1913, 1914. Economic activity is concentrated in this area. Got agricultural and mining primarily out here, and then San Francisco is the main financial center on the West Coast. So it's kind of an interesting historical fact. So the idea in 1914 is, well, we'll have 12 central banks. They'll be able to monitor financial stability within their districts and take care of the money supply within their districts. Remember, that's what a central bank's supposed to do. Oops. Great Depression was not kind to this system. And again, I could go off on a terrible tangent, so if you want me to, I will, but I will save it in case unless there's a question. Basically, you had 12 different central banks all pursuing different monetary policies during the Great Depression. Minneapolis lowered interest rates because they wanted to help out farmers. New York raised interest rates because they wanted to cut off speculation in the stock market. The Atlanta Fed did certain things to help farmers. The Dallas Fed did other things that they thought would help farmers that actually contradicted one another. It was a complete mess. And what you saw between especially 1931 and 1933 was this scene represented, I hope you recognize, by Jimmy Stewart from the famous movie It's a Wonderful Life, where, again, you had banking collapses, but this time they weren't literal. They weren't literally the place was falling down, but people were coming in and demanding their money and saying, I want the cash now. But the problem is that he doesn't have the cash. And in fact, no bank ever has the cash. We operate on what's called a fractional reserve system. Hear that word? Reserve. The idea is banks don't have to keep all of their money in the vault. We'll have this Federal Reserve that'll hold all the extra. And if they get in trouble, the Fed will come in and bring us the cash that we need. Well, if you've seen the movie, the Fed does not come to Jimmy Stewart's saving the loan, building the loan. The Fed completely dropped the ball during the Great Depression. Just blew it. So it was pretty clear in 1932, 33, 34 that the system needed to be reformed. So again, Congress gets together, they appoint some commissions, they have hearings. Basically, 2 plans come up. One is, all right, let's have a central bank like other countries. Right? If you go to Britain, they have a bank called the Bank of England. It's their central bank. Go to Japan, you have the Bank of Japan. Okay, let's have something like that in the United States. We've got other people who are like, no, this system just needs a little tweaking and it'll work fine. Well, if you know a little bit, again, about American history and American politics, we never wipe the slate clean. We always kind of pile things on to what already exists. So, what we do in 1935, pass something called the Federal Reserve Act. We create a new structure in Washington called the Board of Governors that now is in charge of all 12 Federal Reserve banks in terms of monetary policy. Here's the current chair. Her name is Janet Yellen. She's been in for, I think, a year on February 1st. And of course, this is the Federal Reserve building again. There are 7 members of the Board of Governors. One of my big complaints with both Presidents Bush and Obama is that they have not kept the board at full strength. Right now there are only 5 governors, for example, on the board. You would never do that at the Supreme Court. Right? You'd never say, oh, they got 7, that's enough. They do that all the time with the Fed, and yet they need 7 governors there to do the work that's their mandate. We'll talk about their mandate in a moment. But we're going to keep the reserve banks. So they didn't, remember that map I showed you a minute ago? They didn't get rid of those. They kept them. They just put the Board of Governors on top and then had the regional banks underneath. And they're kind of like branches. But they're more than branches because they still have a president. So here's the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, Narayana Kocherlakota. He has 11 and a half months left. He said he's going to resign at the end of his term, effective February 1st, 2016. Here's the bank headquarters. It's on Hennepin Avenue in Minneapolis. Stands on the site of the old Great Northern Railroad Terminal, right here in downtown Minneapolis. So wait a minute, you might say. You got Janet Yellen and the Board of Governors in Washington. You got Fed presidents like Narayana Kocherlakota in Minneapolis and Boston and Philadelphia and all the other places. How do you do monetary policy? Well, again, the U.S. is so wonderful. We don't wipe the slate clean. We say, we'll make them all get into a room and work it out. So they create this thing called the Federal Open Market Committee that meets 8 times a year, and it consists of the 7 members of the Board of Governors, when there's 7. There's 5 right now. The president of the New York Federal Reserve, and then a rotating cast of characters consisting of 4 other regional Fed presidents. They're the ones that make monetary policy. But ultimately, what has happened since 1935 is that the Board of Governors pretty much guide the process. And in particular, the chair has the power. The chair is appointed for 4 years by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and there's no term limits. So technically, Janet Yellen could just keep serving as Federal Reserve Chair as long as presidents keep reappointing her. Alan Greenspan was appointed originally by President Reagan. He was reappointed by President George H.W. Bush, by President Clinton, and by the first President Bush, or excuse me, the second President Bush. So he served, a long time in there, from 1987 to 2006. Ben Bernanke served 2 terms. He was the previous chair. So even though we've got this structure, this is what's on the books, ultimately it's become a situation where the chair of the Federal Reserve does monetary policy. And there's a picture of what the open market meetings look like. They have a big boardroom at that Federal Reserve building, and you can't see it, but here's a picture. It's a mural, actually, of the Federal Reserve districts. It's a really cool mural. I tried to find a good picture of it, but I couldn't find one. All right. Well, what are the goals that they have to actually hit? Well, until 1978, there weren't any. Before 1978, the Federal Reserve was supposed to run monetary policy and ensure the stability of the financial system. And that's all Congress told them to do. They weren't any more specific than that. In 1978, though, and I'll show you some pictures after some questions, Congress was moved to actually codify what they wanted the Fed to do. And the prime mover in that was Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota. When he came back to the Senate in 1970, actually 71, he was shunned by his colleagues because of his role in the Vietnam War. And they gave him a backwater committee assignment called the Joint Economic Committee. He said, here, Hubert, you can have that. Nobody cares about that. he turned it into one of the most powerful committees in Congress by monitoring what was going on at the Federal Reserve, by calling the budget directors in for hearings. And he, along with Congressman Augustus Hawkes of California, first African-American Congress member from California, wrote a piece of legislation that said, oops, turned off my button for a second, that said the Fed has two goals. The Federal Reserve's goals are first to promote maximum employment. Unfortunately, they didn't define that. And ensure price stability. Didn't define that either. And you can imagine why they had to get it through Congress. It started out with very clear goals about what the unemployment rate should be, what the inflation rate should be, and by the time it got to the President Carter's desk, they'd gotten rid of all of that in order to get the votes that were needed. Here's the part, though, that I think is ultimately the most important. It required that the chair of the Federal Reserve report to Congress twice a year. Never before had the Fed actually had to report to Congress and say, here's what we're doing with the mandates you gave us back in 1914. It started the Fed on a path of transparency, on a path where we actually could start to know what they were doing. And so these two items here, promoting maximum employment and ensuring price stability, have come to be known as the Fed's dual mandate. And it's the other thing that makes the Fed unique as a central bank. The first one is that it's got all these regional banks and this Federal Open Market Committee and all this negotiation that they have to do to make monetary policy. The second one is most central banks, in fact, all of them that I'm aware of, only have one mandate: keep prices stable. So, for example, the European Central Bank, their mandate is keep prices stable, we don't care about unemployment. So this came back to haunt them during the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. The European Central Bank's reaction to the financial crisis was, well, is it hurting price stability? No? Okay. It's not our problem. So, as I promised, that's a place to pause. Where can I answer your questions about the structure and history of the Fed before we get into some of the stuff about the dual mandate or about policies?
Go ahead.
Doesn't matter.
Do all the regional banks serve basically the same purpose for the region, or do they all have like specialized purposes now?
That's a really interesting question. Each bank is supposed to do certain functions, but that's changed because, for example, one of them they used to do was clearing checks. When was the last time you wrote a check? Have you ever written a check? But that used to be kind of the thing that the 12 Federal Reserve districts did. They cleared the checks for their areas. They would monitor the banks in their areas. And they still do those things. But increasingly what's happened is each Fed has specialized in something that they think they're relatively good at. So for example, the New York Fed is increasingly specialized in the financial markets on Wall Street and in European international transactions. The San Francisco Fed, if you want expertise on East Asia and the Pacific, that's the place to go. That's where the experts are. Dallas has gotten a specialization in dealing with Latin America, Atlanta with the Caribbean, and so on. So they've kind of found their niches, so to speak. Kind of asks you, where did Minnesota, what was Minnesota's niche? Minnesota's niche was research. Minnesota, the Minneapolis Fed became known as the premier research center in the Federal Reserve System, and still is that way. So, that's the question.
So, you mentioned that they have to report back to Congress. Can Congress change the goals whenever they want, or?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a law. This is a statute. And in fact, this last summer, in fact, I think they're coming up again. They've introduced the bill again in the House of Representatives. There is a new law that's structured as amendments to the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, actually as amendments to the Federal Reserve Act in general, which would require the Federal Reserve to follow a rule for setting its interest rate. That it would have to state, here is how we decide on our interest rates, and defend it to Congress if they deviate from it. So if you've taken macroeconomics, you'll have heard the term Taylor rule or monetary policy rule. The idea is we're going to put that rule into law. So it might be something like the following. If inflation is 2% and the Fed wants it to stay at 2%, then they should keep interest rates at 2%. But if inflation goes up to 4, they should raise interest rates to 5. And if inflation goes up to 6, they should raise interest rates to 7. So there should be some kind of relationship between what's going on in terms of inflation and what's going on in terms of interest rates. It probably will pass the House. The question is whether it would pass the Senate. President Obama hasn't said one way or another whether he would sign such legislation. Don't know.
Louis, to get it local, who appoints or elects the president of the Reserve Bank in Minneapolis? To whom is that person responsible and has to report to? And who does he or she take counsel with? Other bankers in Minneapolis and not St. Paul? Or
I will forget.
They simply fly with their own ideas.
You've got like 3 questions, so I will try to remember them all. So first of all, this is why I was making fun of the idea that we just put something on top. If you go back to the beginning, each of these reserve banks had a board of directors, which then appointed the president. They didn't change that. So it's still that way. So right now, the board of directors for the Minneapolis Fed is engaged in a search for a new president. So each region comes up with their own president. They don't have to talk to Washington. They don't have to talk to the board of governors. They can put whoever they want in there. Sometimes that leads to some really interesting choices. I could tell some stories, but leave off that. Who does he have to accept counsel from? Well, that actually has turned out to be a very interesting issue during President Cocher Lakota's term. The previous president, whose name is Gary Stern, tended to listen to the bank's economists, and in particular their research economists. Cocher Lakota has changed that. He has gone outside the bank for advice, and he's gone both outside the bank to labor leaders, to other bankers, to business people, to people in all kinds of different areas. And he's gone to economists outside the bank, which really made the economists at the Fed mad. Because they're like, what are we here for, right? If you're not talking to us. So I actually wrote a column about this in my column about a year and a half ago about how there's a huge amount of friction having to do with that. That's 2. You had a third one, I think. Who are they responsible for? Ultimately to the board of directors.
And who appoints the board of directors?
Themselves, in a sense. It's like any corporation or anything like that. So they go out and they find people to be on the board. They have search committees.
May be unbroken.
But also, what's interesting is the Minneapolis Fed is one of the few Feds that in its bylaws has a requirement to have a certain number of labor representatives, a certain number of agricultural representatives, a certain number of financial representatives. I can't remember. It's back from the 1930s. Progressivism, that was one of the things that got built into the Fed's own bylaws. And so they actually have one of the better sets of representations on the board, probably, of any of the regional Feds.
Are they required to have equal representation from both parties?
Nope. So there's no political test like that.
A little bit of a precursor to the next one, maybe.
Sorry?
And later this month, next month rather, we'll be doing one on the financial crisis. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of the Federal Reserve played in that. Also, there's some pizza over there, guys. Feel free to have this.
Yes, please. You don't have to wait. Well, go ahead and get something to eat. Let me just put this back up here because it'll be a good way to think about it. So Tyler's question is about the Fed and the financial crisis. Remember that I said the Fed has 2 responsibilities, monetary policy and then monitoring the financial system. Well, imagine that you're in a financial crisis like we saw in September of 2008. This is a pretty unwieldy structure to try and fight a fire like we saw in September of 2008. Getting the Board of Governors together and the President of the New York Fed and these other regional presidents, you could do it on a conference call or something like that. But what ultimately happened was Ben Bernanke, the chair of the Board of Governors, the President of the New York Fed, and then the Secretary of the Treasury formed a three-man team that fought the crisis. And what the Federal Reserve did in the middle of it was greatly expand its power. So let me go way back here. I want to use this. The Fed has the power to regulate banks. Who gets to decide what a bank is? Any ideas? I bet you know, you just think it's too easy. The Fed itself. I mean, Congress has some legislation that gives them guidance, but ultimately the Fed gets to decide what they think a bank is. Well, before September of 2008, a bank looked like most of us would probably envision a bank in our minds, right? It's a kind of a Greek temple or a really solid-looking office building, and people have their tellers, and you go get money, ATM machines, things like that. But what happened was during the financial crisis, the financial institutions that started failing weren't banks like that. They were insurance companies. They were financial institutions that bought bonds from one group of people and sold them to others, known as investment banks. There were hedge funds, companies that speculate, to my mind at least, in a lot of exotic financial instruments. They actually were having, this is why I wanted to have this picture in here, they were having a bank run. It didn't look like this though. And this was the big problem in September of 2008. The Fed was trained to think of bank runs as something that looks like this, where the depositors come to the bank and they ask for their money and you go nuts and you bring the cash in and that takes care of it. Well, what happens when you have a bank run that's happening on stuff like this? The panic is the men and women who are going, oh my God, what are we going to do? They're staring at the screen. The Fed wasn't set up to do that, but it had to learn how to do it. So, sorry, I keep clicking, but I do have the things here. Ben Bernanke at the Board of Governors, the president of the New York Fed, who was Tim Geithner at the time, who became the Treasury Secretary, and then the current Treasury Secretary at the time, Hank Paulson, basically sat down and rewrote the banking laws and said, okay, there's a lot of these companies that are in trouble. They sure look like banks to us. The Fed has the power to bail them out. Except for one, they decided they didn't have the authority for it. I wonder if anybody's heard of it. Anybody heard of it? Come to be a very famous name. Lehman Brothers. They decided that this company, Lehman Brothers, they didn't really have the authority to do it, so they let it fail, which was probably the biggest mistake that the Federal Reserve did during the financial crisis. Because when Lehman Brothers failed, everybody else in the financial system said, who's next? If the Fed isn't going to bail out Lehman Brothers, who are they not going to bail out next time? So after Lehman Brothers failed, that's when the Fed went in with both feet. The Board of Governors announced, look, you want to declare yourself a bank? Raise your hand and we'll call you a bank. And that's what they did. Pretty much any financial institution under the sun that wanted to become a bank became a bank, and now is under the supervision of the Fed. And that's why, I was looking up there, forgot it's not there, that's why that line about macroprudential regulation is so important now. Because in a sense, the Fed has responsibility for the entire financial system by invoking that kind of power, by saying, we're in charge of making sure the whole system stays stable. Well, once you've defined that, where does your authority end? Pretty hard to find where the edge is.
Okay, now you got me really confused because.
Good.
So after
Means I can
after
answer.
the 30s, and they came up with something called depositors insurance, so that I will feel comfortable putting my money in a bank. Well, these things that weren't banks before, but then they said they weren't. They didn't have depositors insurance. did they?
That's right.
Okay.
Exactly. So, but I'm so glad you brought this up because that's how they solved this problem. The Federal Reserve Act was supposed to solve it. You get a bank run like this, oh my God, bank run. We'll drive a big truck of money in and we'll bring it and it'll stop the panic. Well, they didn't do it. Well, if the Fed's not going to do it, let's just create deposit insurance and be done with it. Well, what if you start, here's the problem, you start inventing institutions that aren't banks that don't have deposit insurance. The same problem shows up, like I said, it starts showing up on computers instead of in the lobbies. But they don't know how to deal with it. They have to figure out how to deal with it on the run in 2007, 2008, and 2009. And of course, one option for policy would be to simply create deposit insurance for everything. But that creates another problem, which is, okay, now the deposits are insured of every financial institution. What's to keep them from doing nefarious things with the money, knowing that the Fed will just pay off the deposit insurance? So that's kind of the issue people have been arguing about.
So going back 33 years to Econ 101, there's some vague recollection of gold standard, Bretton Woods, and is there really enough gold to back the economy?
Okay, first answer is, yeah. The question is about the gold standard and whether there's enough gold to back the money and all this kind of stuff. All right, let's go back here because I want to have money supply. The Federal Reserve was founded, pardon? Oh, the Federal Reserve was,
I'll just undergo. Do you think abandoning gold standard helped U.S. during the Great Depression to recover faster?
okay. I will answer those two questions together. It'll work out really well. So the Fed was founded assuming that there would be a gold standard. So when they thought, well, how do you manage the money supply in 1914? It was, okay, make sure we have enough gold to back up the paper money that's out there, and that's it. And if we start to see gold leaving, we need to raise interest rates to bring it back. And if we're accumulating too much gold, we have to lower interest rates and let it go out. So that's basically what you do, is manage the gold flow. What happened during the Great Depression was two things collided. In 1930 especially, what the Federal Reserve needed to do to save the US economy was lower interest rates in order to help farmers and manufacturers. But what would that do? The gold would start flowing out. They had to choose, and they chose the gold standard. They chose to protect the gold standard, keep interest rates high, and basically let the economy collapse around them. They did that, the Bank of England did that, the Bank of France did that, the Central Bank of Germany did it, and basically pulled the whole world economy from a recession into a Great Depression. So getting off the gold standard, it turned out, was one of the key ways to get out of the whole thing. First, Japan in 1930, more spectacularly Britain in 1931, and gradually all the countries, the only one that was the last one to go off the gold standard was France, because they had been the last to get back on after World War I, which is an even longer story. So that gets back to your question. After the Second World War, they tried to come up with a system that would be more flexible than the gold standard, but that people would still have faith in. It came to be called the Bretton Woods system. What the Bretton Woods system was the US would be on a gold standard. $35 per ounce of gold. But only the US would have to hold any. Everybody else could hold dollars, and they would simply match their currency up with the dollar. That worked pretty well from about 1947 until the late 1960s. But one big problem started to really pull the system apart: the Vietnam War. The United States government started printing more and more and more dollars, and countries like France and Germany started to ask the question that you did, which is, excuse me, but do you really have enough gold to trade $35 for every, 35 pieces of paper for every ounce of gold that I have? And they started taking their gold, slowly at first, more quickly as time went on. So in August of 1971, August 15th, in fact, 1971, Richard Nixon did his usual wonderful, he was a very personable guy, warm, fuzzy. Those of you who are old enough to know the joke. He suddenly announces on Sunday, August 15th, 1971, oh, by the way, all of you guys who thought you could trade your gold for dollars, no. The phrase that was used was, he closed the gold window. You literally couldn't present your dollars for gold anymore. And you can imagine that the French and the British and the Germans and the Japanese were not very happy about this. So like Humpty Dumpty, they spent about 18 months trying to put the system back together again. They couldn't. By the spring of 1973, they gave up and said, we're just going to let markets determine what the exchange rates are. So now that's one of the problems that the Fed faces today, continues to face, and is part of the reason for the dual mandate. So this is a good segue into one last set of points that I wanted to make before we go back to questions. I really prefer questions, but I do one thing. So how well has the Fed done? Well, here's the unemployment rate since an arbitrarily chosen date, September 1960, which happens to be when I was born. So that's why I chose it. Notice here in the 1970s what happened. Here's why Humphrey Hawkins got enacted. The Fed didn't seem to be doing a very good job at promoting stability in the economy. We better actually give the Fed some goals that it has to meet. This was Hubert Humphrey's reasoning. And notice, between 1980 and 2008, we've had recessions, but unemployment has been far lower here than it was in here. So the Fed did a pretty good job on that score. Yeah, okay, this isn't so good. Right. That's unemployment. How about inflation or price stability? Here's where the Fed really shines. Here's again the 70s. Those of you who are old enough like me, you remember the 70s. 10% inflation, 21% interest rates, kind of stuff like that. Humphrey Hawkins, again, is to try and stop this. Well, notice the Fed got the message. Here's inflation in the United States since 1990. It's never been above 4%. Here's 4. And it's mostly been around 2. And in fact, notice since the Great Recession, it's only bumped up against 2 once. It's been down here in the 1.5% range. Inflation has pretty much been vanquished in the United States. Now I forgot the question. Somebody asked me a question that was a good transition for this. Forgot now. Anyway, here's our two measures. The Fed seems to have done pretty well, but the question going forward is, all right, are these good enough goals? And in particular, President Kocher-Lakota at the Minneapolis Fed has been focusing on this. And he says the Federal Reserve has pretty much said they want to hit a target of 2%. They've blown it. They can't seem to keep the inflation rate up at 2%. They need to make sure that they don't raise interest rates in the next few months and make this worse. Unfortunately, he's a lone voice. Everybody else on the Fed board seems to think, well, 2% is a ceiling, not a goal, so it's okay to be down. We'll see if they're right or not.
Could I ask the obvious question? Why would you want more inflation?
Couple of reasons. One is a measurement problem. We actually don't measure inflation very well. I mean, we do our best, but the best guess that most of us have is that there's a margin of error of 1 to 1.5% on the inflation rate. So we actually could be at 0 right now. So, there's a measurement problem. So having a goal of 2 is cutting it kind of close. The other reason, though, has to do with interest rates and borrowing. So let's take a look at 2 aspects of that. One aspect has to do with borrowing. And in particular, the idea goes like this. Suppose you borrow $100 from me. And let's agree on an interest rate of, say, 5%. Okay? So in a year, you're going to pay back How much? If you borrow $100, $5 in interest, $100 in principal, you pay me back $105. What if inflation is also 5%? What's the real value of that money that you're paying back to me?
It's $100.
$100. That's really good. That's pretty good. Just $100. All right. Well, notice that means that the amount of interest that you pay is going to depend on the amount of inflation that there is. All right. Well, suppose that inflation was 8%. How much would you have to pay back in real terms?
Well, it would be a very good deal for me.
Well, if I'm the bank, I'm the bank, you're the borrower. You borrow the money, you borrow $100, you owe me 5 more of interest. Inflation is 8. Wait a minute, you just paid me back about $97 in real terms, not 100. I am mad. I do not like this. I want an inflation rate that is low if I am lending money. I want a low, predictable, stable inflation rate. Oh, maybe like 2%, 3%, or 4 even, so this gets back at Mike's question. Maybe a little higher just to make sure that we don't get into some kind of deflationary situation. Which brings me to the other part of it about borrowing money. Now, suppose that you borrow that $100 and prices start to fall. Suppose, for example, that you're a farmer and you're selling a crop at $1 a bushel. And you borrow $100. How many bushels do you have to sell? And actually, I've been picking on you too much. How many bushels do you have to sell? 100. Now suppose the price of whatever it is you're selling falls to 50 cents because of deflation. How much do you have to sell? You now have to sell 200 bushels to pay off the exact same debt. You do not want to find an economy getting into a situation of deflation because all of a sudden everybody's debts are now going to be more difficult to pay. It's called debt deflation. And the idea here is that is a situation that we are facing in the United States right now. This is what Coach Lakota especially is very concerned about. He's worried that this is going to go down here into the negative numbers. And that you're going to find yourself in a situation of rising interest rates. Right? You're going to have to be paying back more than you thought in interest. And the debts are going to get more burdensome. And he can't seem to get any traction on this. He can't seem to get anybody to listen to him at the Fed. There are people outside the Fed who are making this case a lot, but the Fed doesn't seem to want to listen. Other stuff, please, questions. I left this vague on purpose because I wanted to open it up. You guys like?
I was really glad that you confessed that you were born in 1960. These are very interesting charts. I started teaching at St. John's University and College of St. Benedict in fall of 1960. So
I was born September 11th, so
we are both just...
We're connected.
In the first 10 years, I had time to take care of employment pretty well, but I see I started slipping in the second half of...
Yeah, things...
So, what did the increasing problems with the Vietnam War, upheavals in society in America, those that were hell no, I won't go, the others who lined up to get shot on their college campuses, what influence did that have on either one of those charts? I happened to take a study abroad to the Greco-Roman program in the fall of 1980, and there are students, and so we watched the fights going on in the United States of America and the commentary on all those silly people over there, and they decided to throw out a president of people that like to talk about stagflation. I didn't heard you mention stagflation.
Well, I didn't use the word.
Handle the Vietnam War and
stagflation in 5 minutes. No, but actually I did talk about it, but I didn't use the word. Here's stagflation. High unemployment and high inflation at the same time. So we've had the opposite until the financial crisis. We've had relatively low inflation. Whoops, that's my nice thank you. and relatively low unemployment. So, in a sense, a way to talk about Humphrey Hawkins and about what the Fed's done over the last 30 years is they conquered stagflation. What President Coach Lakota is really concerned about is that, well, maybe I'm putting words in his mouth. What I'm really concerned about, I guess to be really honest, is we have a lot of policymakers who can't seem to get this out of their heads. They are obsessed with, oh my gosh, this might happen again when we are down here like this. Or as the economist John Maynard Keynes once said, you've got a whole bunch of people yelling fire in the midst of Noah's flood. And that you're going to do exactly the wrong thing in this situation. Now, Vietnam, I think, is very much in this inflation spikes here. These two are primarily from the oil crises of 73 and 79, but this one here is primarily from first President Johnston and then President Nixon fighting the Vietnam War without increasing taxes. And for all practical purposes, printing money without telling anybody to do it. So that's what got inflation going in here.
So let's say hypothetically,
You were leaving.
we make a bad choice.
A bad choice.
Yes. And what are the repercussions, in your view? Or we make a good choice. What
On which way?
on the interest rates.
Oh, okay. So I would argue that the downside to raising interest rates is a lot worse than the ups, is a lot more likely than the up. So what's the downside? The downside of raising interest rates is that inflation will start creeping or maybe even drop pretty quickly. So you'll end up with debt deflation and you'll have pressure on people who owe money at a time when the economy is still quite weak, in my mind. It's doing a lot better, but there's still a lot of fragility there. The upside of raising interest rates is there is a theory, I sound like Scotty from Star Trek, there is a theory out there that says by raising interest rates, you will actually raise the inflation rate. I'm not confident enough in that theory to do a controlled experiment on the United States economy with it. Maybe somebody else would be, but I just assumed keep rates low for now, 0, and see what happens. See if we can get this. And in fact, what I would do if I were chair of the Fed, which I never ever will be, of course. I should have stuck some extra slides in here. We'll learn that for next time. Is I actually would have never have stopped quantitative easing. I wouldn't have ended it. I would have kept it going. And in fact, I might have even increased it to try and get inflation up in the 3 and 4% range so that we have that cushion in there. And I think that's off the table, unfortunately, right now. So I don't know if that answers your question about the bet, but I would bet on the side of trying to keep interest rates low. And if inflation starts to get above 4, we know how to stop inflation. We figured that out in the 70s, right? You just raise interest rates like mad, cut the money supply down, basically throw the economy into a recession. We know how to do that, so let's do that. Let's do that if we need to, but let's not do it preemptively, right? Let's not create a depression or a recession just because we're worried that the inflation rate might get to 5%. God forbid.
So you mentioned that the presidents were printing a whole bunch of money during the Vietnam War to pay for it. So what was President Obama's role with monetary policy during the Great Recession?
None. Basically what Humphrey Hawkins did and then what Fed chairs since the early 1980s, Volcker, Greenspan, and their successors have done is to make the Fed much more transparent. And so a president really can't go to the Federal Reserve anymore and say, will you please print lots of money to make this work? Can't get away with it anymore. And especially with Humphrey Hawkins, the Fed chair has to report twice a year to Congress everything that they're doing. So That's been taken off the table. So President Obama, for all practical purposes, didn't have anything to do with monetary policy except appointing the chair. He reappointed Ben Bernanke in 2010 to provide continuity, and then appointed new members of the board as ones left. Not enough of them. At one time, they were down to a chair and 2 governors. Again, you'd never let the Supreme Court have like 3 justices. It's crazy, but we do it with the Fed.
What kind of wages does the chairman and the presidents of the central banks get?
I think the chair of the Fed gets about 120,000, right in there, and the regional banks are around that area too. They're right around 100,000, which is a joke that I've been telling. It's why more and more economists are becoming Fed bank presidents, because bankers won't take $120,000, but economists will. We're happy to take it. Give me the job.
Who benefits from an understaffed board of governors? What's the incentive and what are the things?
I don't think anybody does. I think, frankly, it's either just not having their act together on staffing federal agencies, or not understanding how important it is to actually have 7 governors to divvy up the work of bank regulation, macroprudential regulation, and monetary policy. They just don't understand it. So basically, benign neglect. I don't think anybody benefits at all. Please.
During the recession, we heard a lot about the housing bubble, and bankers pretty much playing a game they knew that would eventually fail with mortgage-backed securities. So what is the Fed doing to create a new policy, if they can at all, to keep bankers from pretty much playing an extremely dangerous game?
What's frustrating is that there was a set of regulations that come under the name of the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act. Supposedly gave the Fed power to start regulating some of the things that went wrong during that time. They have all kinds of exotic names like credit default swaps and mortgage-backed securities, and the list goes on and on. But then the Fed is supposed to write rules to do it. Well, there's where an understaffed board of governors starts to come in. They haven't been able to get that done. They've had their hands full just trying to manage the day-to-day stuff that the Fed has to do. So basically, they're nowhere with that. They've come up with a few things for managing money market mutual funds, because actually this comes back to your question. During the crisis, the Federal Reserve actually extended deposit insurance to money market funds because everybody was taking their money out of them and was causing a panic. So for 18 months, they actually had deposit insurance on there. So they formulated formal rules for that said, here are the circumstances in which we will do that. Otherwise, they are uninsured. But they haven't gotten to the other stuff that's really important.
Do they have anything, because I just, was doing a little bit of reading about it. Just bankers were pretty much, basically writing off that this was, AAA mortgage back, these were people that were sure to pay it back. Is there anything that they can do to really reach in, even though those regulations are already in place?
We could get down into the weeds in this, but I think I have a better way to answer your question. Before the financial crisis, the way that economists and especially people at the Fed thought about this was, we really can't do anything about that. If bankers want to play games and stuff like that, there's no way for us to find that out. What we will do is be ready to clean up the mess afterwards and contain it, and it won't be that bad. Does anyone agree with that now? Right? That did not work. In 2008 and 2009, the mess wasn't a cup of milk, it was a whole dairy. Spilled all over the country. And that kind of policy isn't going to work, but now what have we got in its place? Not much. We really pretty much still have that kind of policy. And one of my frustrations is that that hasn't gotten at the top of the policy agenda. It tends to get buried down in the details, and as soon as you get buried down in the details, you're starting to talk about lobbyists and the staffers and the people who are kind of out of the limelight making the rules, and the people in Congress just kind of go, oh yeah, okay, whatever you say, sign it.
So there are those that are saying the current Congress is going to try to gut the Dodd-Frank Act. What will they gut, and what would if there's nothing been done with it, what would they gut or what will they change?
Well, there are a couple of things. It is after 6, so I understand that people want to leave, so I'm not trying to keep you in the room. Thank you for coming. One big thing that people don't like is that there are strict regulations on the kinds of assets. This actually does come back to your question that banks are allowed to hold on their balance sheets. And the big problem that a lot of people don't like is that the same rules apply to the big bad banks that hold the system down and to the small community banks in places like St. Cloud. And so one way to fix it would be to differentiate. But what seems to be happening is we're just going to throw the whole thing out, which would be pretty sad. I think that would be a really lousy idea. The other thing is there's a consumer financial protection board as part of it, and I don't think that the lobbyists will ever stop until they kill that, because it puts rules on clarity of credit card applications, puts rules for fraudulent consumer lending, and the banking industry has despised that from day one.
I think it's a pretty good segue into the next Econ in English, which is next month, on how the heck did the financial crisis happen. And big shout out to Louis. Thank you so much for that. There, big shout out to